You're watching Talking Points, a focus on the political scene in Lubbock and across the South Plains.
And welcome back. Here's a look at some of the political headlines of the past week. We've talked about longtime Panhandle Congressman Mac Thornberry's retirement. A familiar name has popped up on the list of potential replacements. Levelland native and Navy Rear Admiral Ronnie Jackson is said to be thinking about a campaign. Admiral Jackson had been the president's chief physician and nominee to head the Department of Veteran Affairs, but withdrew from consideration after allegations that he mishandled prescription drugs. He does continue to work in the White House, though. The Democratic candidate running for Texas House seat held by Lubbock's John Frullo ending her campaign. Samantha Fields saying family obligations is the reason for the departure. Fields ran for the same position in 2018, ended up with a respectable 40% of the vote. Almost hard to fathom that after 27 years of service in Lubbock as district attorney and 99th District Court judge, Bill Souter's about to step down. A potential replacement's already stepped up to run for the 99th. Philip Hayes has been an attorney for nearly 30 years, spent some time as judge of Lubbock's County Court at Law Number 3. And Mr. Hayes said to join us on next week's show. Lost a bit in the impeachment talk, the U.S. Supreme Court hearing arguments on the future of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program. Several tech students actually made the trip to D.C. to watch the arguments. Others traveled to Austin to protest, and KMAX Wes Rappaport spoke with some of them.
We are the immigrants!
I hope that they see us more as an asset to this country than a threat.
DACA recipients like Diego Corso are worried about their future in the United States. Corso is a realtor in Austin who owns 10 properties. His tenants and employees rely on his income. All that could be in peril if he's deported back to Peru, where he came from 20 years ago.
If I can contribute to my business or continue to expand it, my employee is not going to have a job.
Corso is in the nation's capital to share his story as demonstrators from Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma rallied near the Texas Capitol, defending DACA and its 800,000 recipients across the country.
I became a DACA recipient in 2016.
Maribel Rosas came from Mexico 2 decades ago. She's now working as a bank teller and bought a house this year.
Only opportunities that we want is for our better future for us and for children.
Tuesday's Texas rally was held outside the office of the state's Attorney General, Ken Paxton. Paxton has led efforts to repeal the program. He calls it a lawless exercise of executive power and says the Trump administration's decision to rescind DACA is a necessity to uphold the rule of law.
No matter what the court says, no matter what Trump says, no matter what Governor Abbott says, whatever Ken Paxton says, we're going to continue to push for immigrants' rights.
The Supreme Court is expected to issue its ruling in the summer. In Austin, Wes Rappaport, KMAC News.
All right, Wes, thank you so much, and we're happy to spend 5 good minutes talking more about this with attorney David Strange, who, with the Wittenberg Law Firm here in Lubbock, handles a lot of local immigration cases. It's good for you to spend a few minutes with us. We certainly appreciate it. Give folks a sense of the depth of the issue here. Are there a lot of folks who live in the area who could be affected by the court's eventual decision here?
Yes. So in Lubbock, there are many people with DACA, students, small business owners, professionals, and so our practice has a sizable number of DACA clients. But then, of course, Texas itself has many of the same type of people, meaning students, small business owners, regular employees of businesses, but also many professionals, including professors, attorneys, people who now have entered into medical school. Just before we came on, you mentioned that many of these DACA kids have grown up and entered into the workforce. And so throughout the country, there's an estimated 750,000 of these people.
You know, considering the makeup of the court, if they side with the Trump administration now, do we know if that means the program just ends right away, or what happens there?
That's a really good question. And so many people watching the proceedings pretty much tend to think that, well, it's going to be 4 justices on one side, 4 justices on the other side, Chief Justice Roberts in the middle. So the Trump administration, when it first announced that it was going to do away with DACA, the approach was to go slow in order to give time to Congress to come up with a congressional remedy. And in fact, President Trump tweeted just that yesterday, saying, okay, you know, we should win here, the Trump administration, but now it's on Congress to come up with a remedy to address these DACA people. But without Congress, so if the Trump administration prevails here in this instance, without Congress stepping up, these people just fall out of status.
If I'm a dreamer then, what are my options at that point?
Well, that's going to come down to a case-by-case basis. So just as you mentioned earlier, some of these people have grown up, entered into the workforce. Well, some of these people have also married U.S. citizens. Some of these people have obtained professional degrees. And so other options might have opened up for many of them. But of course, that's just going to come down to a case-by-case determination. Although for people who have more permanent option, you would assume that at this point they would have transitioned from DACA to something more permanent. Right. So the majority of the people are going to be left with no options.
Wow. Are there any other citizenship or guest worker cases or status setups that could be affected by this decision? Is this precedent setting for anything else?
Well, it certainly goes to executive power, and prosecutorial discretion, and also, you know, what one administration can do and what the subsequent administration can step in and undo. So this case is not right now before the Supreme Court is not whether the executive has the authority to do this, but it's how the authority did it. So in other words, you didn't comply with the APA. And so a concern here is that, you know, be careful what you wish for. You know, because those who oppose DACA now might have an issue in the future that the people support, but a subsequent administration comes in and says, well, we've got precedent.
Change the whole thing.
President Trump did it, so we're going to do it now.
Interesting. You know, the White House has promised an eventual plan that would have to do more about letting people in with certain work skills than family relations that we've seen in the past. Are there a lot of folks coming to your office kind of worried about that as well? Yes, of course. So the Trump administration wants to move away from a family-based immigration approach to more of a, what it calls a merits-based immigration approach. And so, you know, arguments can be made, and so the merits of that is not what we're discussing right now, but in terms of how that affects overall immigration to the United States, it's huge, and so there are many people who are concerned about that. But also conversely, there are some immigrants who don't like DACA at all, and that's because the particular person may not be DACA eligible, and that person then becomes an enforcement priority, because that's what DACA is all about, shifting enforcement priorities. So, but yes, many people are concerned about the Trump administration's approach to really revamp the basic structure of U.S. immigration. It's so complicated, and I think it's getting more complicated by the minute. Stay close. Can we just keep you on speed dial a little bit from when the next thing comes up here? We'll have you back, let you explain. Attorney David Strange from Wittenberg Law Firm in Lubbock. Good to see you. Likewise, thanks.